my amendment, prior and existing nuclear power will also be excluded from the base amount, which would then mean, my colleagues, when you take the 20% renewable electricity standard, the amount for a renewable electricity standard will be lower and less of a burden for states to meet. Now, we're going to have an amendment later on talking about the definition of nuclear energy as a renewable energy resource. But that's not the debate here. It's just saying that you're going to recognize nuclear power as a source of renewable energy, and in fact, the way the bill's written now, it's only going to be recognized for new construction. And we all know this could be 10, 15, 20 years. So my amendment is saying, let's recognize nuclear energy that's already built and exists. And I particularly bring this attention to folks in Arkansas that have a nuclear power plant. Obviously in Florida we have one, around Tampa we have a nuclear power plant. So that nuclear power plant in Tampa under the manager's amendment would not be recognized, only new construction. So all that nuclear power in Tampa would not get credit under the base amount when you determine what the retail electric supplier's base amount would be for the state. And I think the nuclear power plant in Tampa should be. Now, we're trying to build a nuclear plant in the northern part of my district, but that's going to take a long time. The bill says you can recognize that, but I say, why discriminate? Why not also include those nuclear plants around the country, not just in Arkansas, but they're in California, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia. I've got a list here, if anybody wants to see it: Illinois, Kansas, Louisiana, New Jersey, New York, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Ohio, Tennessee. I could go on. Almost most of the states in the Union have a nuclear power plant. The manager's amendment excludes them from being part of the credit for green energy, because nuclear energy has no CO2 emissions. So your state, if it has a nuclear power plant, will not benefit. So I hope you'll look at my amendment in a bipartisan fashion and say, okay, the manager's amendment says it's okay if it's built, it'll be part of the solution, but if it's existing, it won't be. So by taking out those 11 words on page 23 of the manager's amendment, we essentially move this into the equation, which allows your state, to ultimately, it'll be easier for you to meet the RES, and more importantly, the retail electric supplier's base amount will be lower, so 20% of that lower amount will mean it'll be easy for your state to comply. But more importantly, this simple change would allow states that have existing nuclear power plants to more easily meet the renewable electric standard. So it has one of fairness, because the manager's amendment said new plants can have it. So this is fairness. Why not recognize old plants? And two, it'll allow renewable electric standard to be more easily met by your state. So I think it should be a given, Mr. Chairman. Perhaps.
Gentlemen, yield.
Yeah, I'd be glad to yield.
Your staff told us that the amendment you wanted to bring up was to take nuclear out of the baseline. This amendment defines nuclear as a renewable. No, it's just the opposite. Okay. We thought you were going to offer one amendment. We're not for either.
No, you're not for either. I can't convince you on this then, huh?
Well, without objection, gentlemen, be given an additional minute,
sure.
And I'd like him to
I
yield
would appreciate this colloquy, because
thank you.
I would like to understand your objection, because I think a lot of members on your side that have nuclear power plants that I've just mentioned would benefit, as I say, in fairness, and also in the fact that it'd be more easily for them to meet the renewable electric standard.
Well, I thank you for yielding. We spent a lot of time negotiating with members on the renewable electricity standard, and as you point out, several members expressed concern that nuclear power was not addressed in the standard. So we struck a delicate balance. We agreed that electricity from new nuclear generation units would come out of the utilities baseline. In other words, utilities wouldn't have to generate more renewable power as a result of bringing new nuclear power plant online, the RES doesn't create any disincentive for nuclear power. On the other hand, nuclear power doesn't receive renewable electricity credits under the RES because it's not a renewable power. Nuclear power is fueled by uranium, which is a finite natural resource. It's also a mature technology currently supplying 18% of our nation's electricity. If nuclear power received credits under the RES, the standard would have to be much, much higher. So that's what was our thinking about the matter, and we did part of what you wanted, but not all of what you wanted. We can't go as far as you want to go.
My staff has indicated that you might have the wrong amendment.
Yes.
You're talking about. Is it a possibility that the amendment that I have before me, and which I've described, you don't have that same amendment? We're not talking about the same thing. Because I think we have a little. I think you recognize that you might have the wrong amendment. I think
there has been a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
But would you prefer the other amendment to be by unanimous consent?
Yes, let's do that by unanimous consent. So then
Okay.
you have the right amendment.
So what we're proposing is that by unanimous consent, the amendment by Mr. Stearns that will be in order for consideration at this point will be the amendment that will keep nuclear power, deal with nuclear power on the baseline question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, let's just. Yeah. I'm sorry for the confusion. I don't know if.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, who seeks recognition?
Yes, this is the right one.
Mr. Chairman, I'm asking which is the amendment that was passed out the amendment we are considering, or is it now?
No, the amendment we're considering is the amendment that's now being passed out, and the amendment that members received is not the amendment we are considering.
And let me.
Do you want to take another 2 or 3 minutes to clarify this?
Read the amendment to the amendment in the nature of substitute offered by myself. Page 23, line 8, strike, placed in service after the date of enactment of this section. And let me just review, particularly for those on the other side of the aisle that have a nuclear power plant. If you vote against my amendment, what you're saying is when what's called the total retail electric supplier base amount, which is your total amount of electricity that's used in your state, they're going to include your nuclear power plant. But your nuclear power plant has no CO2 emissions. So it should not be part of it. So let's take an arbitrary figure of, let's say, 10 gigawatts is your total state's power. But that includes your nuclear power, let's say, which is 2 gigawatts. If you take it out and consider it a renewable, then the 20% of your total state will be less. It's only fair. If the manager's amendments say it's okay to have nuclear as a renewable after the bill's passed, only new construction, what about all the old construction? So it's one of fairness, and second of all, it'll make it easier for your state to meet the renewable electric standard because this power plant will be taken out of your total electricity because it doesn't have CO2 emissions, and so the 20% of the number will be less. Now, if there's anybody that doesn't quite understand, I try to make it as simple as possible, and the fact that we've had so much what appears to be partisan amendments here, in your opinion, this is not a partisan amendment. This is something, Mr. Chairman, in all honesty, I think you would have to say, arbitrarily say that no nuclear power will be considered except new construction is discouraging those folks that already have nuclear power plants. And I've got, in the state of Illinois, they got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I mean, so why, Mr. Chairman, should we discourage and prevent those nuclear power plants from getting credit as a renewable so that in the end, their total electricity for the state will come down when you take the nuclear out, and then the 20% of the base amount will be less, and they'll be clearly able to comply. So I just ask, again, on the basis of fairness, and two, make your state have an easier time to comply because the 20% will be lower. Does that make sense, Mr. Chairman?
I understand your argument, yes.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman?
That's the main thing. And I hope members on that side, if you don't understand my argument, let's have it because if you vote no against this, you're voting against your existing nuclear power plant. And California's got quite a number of here. And I think, I mean, in your heart of hearts, as much as you're for global warming or as much as you're for renewables, why discriminate against your nuclear power plant that's already existed and provided all the electricity for your state for all these years? Give it the benefit of the doubt. Make it part of this solution because there's no CO2 coming from it.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Harman.
Mr. Chairman, I agree that this is not a partisan amendment, and I applaud that. I think after a very long yesterday, it's nice to start off today with an amendment that is, I think, pitched to be good policy, but I'm not sure I think it is good policy, and that's why I wanted to ask you a couple of things, Mr. Chairman. I don't have any nuclear power plants in my district, but there is nuclear power in California, and I have said on a number of occasions that I do think nuclear power should be part of our mix going forward, and perhaps should be in this bill. Nonetheless, I'm just asking you, Mr. Chairman, to amplify the record on a point you just made, which I think is where I come out, which is, as I understood it, that nuclear power is not a renewable, and that, therefore, if you are trying to come up with the proper standard, you can't grandfather in existing nuclear power. Did I understand that correctly, and could you explain that a little more for the record so that I'm confident that I'm making the right vote?
Yes, I certainly think nuclear power has to be part of the mix, and we don't discriminate against nuclear power. It's going to be used and is already being used. But in terms of defining a renewable, it is not a renewable. But in terms of deciding how much we need to get by way of new renewables, we have a compromise, and we've said in the future, new nuclear power will not be counted in the base, so that it won't change the amount of it won't require more renewables. But if we go back and bring in all the existing nuclear power plants, it would mean that the renewables ought to be much higher than the amount we have. So the compromise dealt with the amount of renewables that would be required, and we didn't want to make it so high that if we brought in all the old nuclear power plants, it would be a great burden. Perhaps Mr. Markey might want to further elaborate on that, but I appreciate the question.
Let me just reclaim my time and say something, then yield to Mr. Markey and Mr. Upton. I'm persuaded by that. I understand that. I asked you the question so that we could have a clearer record. I know there are, and I know Mr. Markey's going to say this too, enormous safety issues and proliferation issues connected to nuclear power, but nonetheless, Al Gore and President Obama and many others think some nuclear power is in our future, and so do I, and I don't want to discourage it. On the other hand, I don't want to use it to discriminate against the true renewables that we're trying to promote in the bill. I now yield to Mr. Markey.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady very much. 20% of our electrical generation in the United States today is nuclear. We have more nuclear power than France has. Okay? We're the largest nuclear country in terms of electrical generation in the world. It is a technology which in the 1992 Energy Policy Act received permission to have an application for construction and operation, meaning a 10-year gap, and all compressed down into one application. In the 2005 Energy Act, we actually extended that to the new smaller 100 megawatt plants. We give it insurance protection, the Price-Anderson Act. Loan guarantees were included in the 2005 and 2007 laws for nuclear power. Mr. Dingell yesterday had an amendment to create a new a body that would be able to be able to grant loans to the nuclear industry. It is and has been a very favored industry under U.S. law. However, the intent of the renewable electricity standard, as we have listed in the bill, is to provide incentives for a whole range of nascent technologies that have the potential of really providing a new generation of electrical generating capacity for our country. And let me just go down that list. Wind energy, solar energy, these are the technologies that do get credits under this provision. Wind, solar, geothermal, renewable biomass, biogas derived from renewable biomass, qualified hydropower, marine and hydrokinetic renewable energy, fuel cells, landfill gas, waste.
Gentlemen, you.
Gentleman's time has
Can
expired.
I ask the
Gentlelady.
gentlelady
Gentlelady's
an
time
additional
is
minute?
Without objection, the gentlelady be given another.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and can I yield 30 seconds of it to Mr. Markey and 30 seconds to Mr. Upton, please?
I thank the gentlelady. Wastewater treatment gas, coal mine methane, qualified waste to energy, including combustion of municipal solid waste and construction and demolition waste, animal waste, algae. There's a triple credit in here for distributed generation, efficiency savings in many, many forms. So we're taking all of those new energy technologies that are just exploding and saying, and we work with the members to ensure that many definitions that have been excluded, municipal solid waste and much of the biomass is now included as part of it. And we worked hard to broaden the definition, and we think that's where it belongs. Nuclear is a more mature technology. It receives tremendous benefits in other parts of the U.S. Code, but we think this is just a special area.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Markey, I'd like to yield to Mr. Upton.
Yeah, I thank the gentlelady.
How
for
about
yielding.
this, Mr. Upton? Why don't I call on you for 5 minutes?
Well, I can probably do this in 30 seconds. Then
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I just want to say that, Mr. Wax, Mr. Chairman, I think it was you that mentioned a few minutes ago about the percentage of renewables. I think on our side, we would accept a higher renewable percentage if, in fact, we could include nuclear, not only new nuclear, but also old nuclear, existing nuclear. And frankly, I think there's a lot of support on our side to take existing hydro as well. And if we can increase the number and expand the base to include those, I think you'd have pretty much universal support over here. And maybe instead of just negotiating with that side of the aisle, maybe we ought to be talking to some of the folks here. Maybe we can work together on an amendment, and I look forward to doing that.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
To seek second. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support the Stearns amendment about the retail electric suppliers base. And here's why. This is not about nuclear power plants that we're trying to protect here. But each state is going to have to meet this requirement of renewable, 20% renewable. And right now, renewables are providing less than around 1% of all electricity produced in the country. And the key point is, if a state does not attain that goal, reach that 20%, then there's going to be a penalty per kilowatt hour of 2.5 cents. And we did a calculation of just an average manufacturing plant in my district. The original was a 5 cent per kilowatt hour penalty, which amounted to over $20,000 a month in increased electrical cost. Well, the 2.5, which you reduced it to 2.5, so that would increase the electrical cost for an average manufacturing plant to over $10,000 a month. So that's why this is so important, because it is going to make it easier for these entities to attain this goal. And if they do not attain the goal, the penalty is going to be upon those people paying the electric rates. And that affects the competitiveness of the American industry in providing jobs in America with other countries. And if our electric rates go up, and they will go up, there will be penalties if you do not meet this renewable standard. So I think that's why it makes a lot of sense to adopt the Stearns Amendment to increase, to provide, make it easier for these states and entities to meet this requirement. Because if they don't meet the requirement, there's going to be some consequences. And with that, I would yield back. I would yield to the gentleman from Oregon.
I thank the gentleman for yielding because I think he makes a very good point, and I think the gentleman from Michigan makes a good point as well. At least if you took all these into account in the baseline, you'd have a more accurate reflection of what's renewable and not. And then you could go from there. We may debate what that percentage should be from there. I look at, the chairman makes the comment that you can't necessarily include nuclear because it's not a renewable. And I guess I can understand that logic. What the logic I don't get, though, is hydro is clearly a renewable. And you don't include all hydro in the baseline. So the last discussion draft last week, I believe the date that was set was hydro after 2000 or 2001 was renewable, 2001. In this bill now, hydro after 92 is renewable. And I'm trying to figure out how water flowing through a dam producing electricity is renewable if that facility was created after 92, but if it was developed during FDR's time, it's not renewable energy. I don't understand that. I don't think there's a logical explanation for that, and I think either hydropower is renewable energy or it's not, and if it's renewable, it should be included. And yet the majority, or at least some on the majority side, say hydropower is only renewable if it is put in place by some arbitrary date, 1992.
Reclaiming my
Yes.
time, I'll yield to the gentleman from Indiana.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I think we have a wonderful opportunity here, and I'm curious if my friend Ms. Harmon of California would be interested if we could convince Mr. Stearns to withdraw this amendment, and what we do is we go ahead and expand the base to include hydro and nuclear, and whether the gentlelady would be supportive of offering such an amendment with us.
I like the tone of this conversation a lot, Mr. Bouyer, and in the abstract, my answer to that would be yes, but I would, it is the chairman and a few others who have carefully constructed a deal to promote new sources of energy. That's the conversation we've been having here, including new nuclear as a source of energy. And as you heard me say, I am not against nuclear, and I gather from the comments of Mr. Markey and the chairman that they're not either. I don't know. I would put the question to them. Is there a way forward here to revisit this in some way at this point? Or I'd certainly suggest once the bill is reported from committee that we continue this discussion and perhaps maybe come up with something.
I'd like to
before.
reclaim my time, and the chairman might want to respond in just a minute, but I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from Tennessee.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I do support the amendment, and I support looking at nuclear, including nuclear and hydroelectric power as renewables. In Tennessee, we know that wind and solar, I've got an article I'd love to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman, and it talks about TVA and a forum that was held to look at renewables, and there's a quote from Senator Alexander in here saying the one renewable source that will not work well for Tennessee is wind power. So in trying to do our part, we know that hydroelectric power and nuclear power is an imperative that we use. We know if it's not included in the RES, that it will be impossible for us to meet those standards, and that our electric rates per consumer, and consumers do look at rates, will go up 42% is what is expected. So I would ask that we do consider that, and I yield back to the gentleman from Kentucky.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Markey.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Again, for new nuclear power, which is constructed in our country, it is excluded from the baseline in terms of what the renewable electricity standard is. The Energy Information Agency expects 20,000 new megawatts of nuclear capacity to come online through the year 2030 with all of the current incentives for nuclear power that are on the books. Electric utilities have filed 17 new applications with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for 26 new reactor operating licenses just over the last couple of years. There are loan guarantee programs out there. We provide the Price-Anderson insurance protection for them. It's a mature industry. These are the largest utilities in the United States that, for the most part, constitute the electric utility industry. They're a very wealthy industry. On the other hand, the American wind industry says that if this amendment was adopted, that it would reduce by 38% the amount of new wind power that would be generated in the United States, that there would be a 25% reduction overall in the new generation of electricity from the renewables that we've defined in the bill. Well, we're trying to encourage now renewables from waste, from biomass, from wind, from solar, from geothermal, from that whole list. Nuclear has done extremely well over the years. It continues to do well in the 1992, 2005, and 2007 energy bills. They were and continue to have tremendous support. And again, as I pointed out, Mr. Dingell's amendment yesterday opens up a new program where upwards of 30% of that program can also go towards new nuclear technology. We're talking about something here that is very exciting to the American people. It represents a breakthrough in terms of all of these new technologies that have been bottled up and are ready to explode. And it's not meant to be achieved at the expense of nuclear power or coal. They each have huge roles in this mix. In fact, the nuclear industry believes that just by moving to a cap-and-trade system, by putting a price on carbon, by saying that there has to be less carbon in our society, that it is central to the complete revival of the nuclear industry. So cap-and-trade itself is something central to their long-term well-being. They all say that. In fact, Constellation Energy, which is one of the largest nuclear utilities in the United States, in endorsing this legislation, Constellation Energy applauds the proposed climate change legislation as a promising first step in promoting greater investment in renewable technology, energy efficiency, and new nuclear. That's their press release that they put out 2 days ago. They're one of the small handful of the largest nuclear power companies in the United States. So, again, there's a balance. We want to render to nuclear the things that are nuclear and render to wind and solar and renewables from waste.
Yeah, will the gentleman yield?
Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman yield.
Let me continue, please. That's really the dilemma that we have here. But at the same time, I'll yield to the gentleman from California.
Let me see if I understand this. We want to develop more renewable alternatives that are that do not include carbon emissions in our electricity. We want more of all of the above. We want to diversify our portfolio of sources of electricity. We don't want to do this at the expense of coal, and we don't want to do it at the expense of nuclear. We don't want to do it at the expense of hydro, but we want to encourage investment in these new renewable fuels. So this section provides that we're going to have 15% renewable and up to 20% combination of renewable and efficiency. And if the state can't get to the 15%, we let them go to 12%. But if we count in all the existing sources of electricity that are already used, like hydropower and nuclear, and say if you've done a good enough job, that's enough, you don't really promote this new renewable fuels. Some people say, well, let's just raise the amount of renewable fuels that we'll require and count in the baseline, hydro and nuclear. Well, if we did that, we'd have to readjust the numbers in order to encourage that renewable fuels market. The compromise that was worked out in the proposal that's before us, it said we'll count new nuclear and not in the baseline so we can, in effect, allow that to be encouraged, especially with the new technology for nuclear, but not to call it
Mr.
a
Chairman.
Renewable. Is that where we are? And
Mr. Chairman.
That is correct, Mr.
Mr. Markey's time has expired.
Move to strike the last word.
Recognition? Mr. Blunt is next on the Republican side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've mentioned a couple of times the compromise that this bill, this language represents. It does seem to me, first of all, the compromise was a compromise that the majority reached, because we haven't really been in this discussion. And the whole idea of renewables, I mean, there are many people in this room, and certainly on this side of the room, that believe that hydro is a renewable. The argument that nuclear is not a renewable because of the uranium content, it seems to me that's like arguing that wind is not a renewable because of the metal it takes to build the towers. Nuclear is clearly largely an investment that I would see as a potential renewable. But that argument aside, since I think there is a legitimate disagreement there, it would seem to me that the compromise is actually the language that Mr. Stearns has recommended. Many of us believe nuclear should be a renewable. Many of us apparently believe it should not be a renewable. The compromise should be, let's just take nuclear, current and future, off the table that counts toward this calculation. And that would be the logical compromise, not the idea that, and there's no carbon. There seem to be a lot of different agendas and goals here. We talk about how the goal is no carbon, but then somehow existing hydro and most new hydro doesn't meet the category. It doesn't meet the standard of a renewable. Or the goal is no carbon, but nuclear, new or old, doesn't count as a renewable. At best, it counts as a neutral, because you don't count new nuclear against the number that the utility is trying to measure against. The compromise would be to take it all off the table rather than to decide to take some of it off the table. And that would be much more in the middle of this debate.
Gentlemen, yield.
Than a debate that we're going to count some nuclear, some existing nuclear doesn't have any impact on anything except it counts toward the overall base load. New nuclear counts as a neutral, apparently, because it just doesn't count in any way that impacts the situation, no matter how much you've invested. And hydro doesn't count at all. And I would yield to the chairman.
I thank you for yielding. This is a compromise we would have liked to have worked out with the Republican members, but the Republican members did not wish to negotiate it with us. So we negotiated with and have the agreement with this proposal with Duke Energy, American Electric Power, Edison Electric Institute, Exelon, PG&E Corporation, FPL Group, Entergy, Austin Energy, Constellation Energy, Seattle City Light, Public Service Enterprise, PNM Resources. The people who provide us the electricity, they think this makes sense, and I would hope that I could see what you're arguing, but if these groups that provide the electricity thinks this serves their interest as well as the public interest, I think we have already a good compromise.
So the compromise is between the majority and essentially the utility companies, Mr. Chairman. Is that what you're telling me?
The compromise is among majority members and with the industries who are involved in making sure that they can meet the demands of their ratepayers, their consumers, and live within the direction we're taking to encourage new renewables as a diversification of our sources for electricity.
Well, in that discussion, I don't know how much power those negotiators brought to the table, but I think it's a poor compromise, and I support the Stearns amendment, and I would yield to Mr. Walden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just point out, too, in that discussion, the quote from Peter Orzog, the now head of the Office of Management Budget, when he was CBO director in 2007, he said, if you don't auction the permits, it would represent the largest corporate welfare program that's ever been enacted in the history of the United States. All the evidence suggests that what would occur is that corporate profits would increase by approximately the value of the permits. And I know that the allocation process that was negotiated apparently sure allocates those permits, doesn't auction them. I would get back to hydro, though. And the majority says they want to encourage new renewable energy production. And yet on page 15, line 4, when they define new hydro, they basically exclude it by definition. And I'll have an amendment later on to deal with that. But the language in the bill doesn't do what is being claimed is occurring. And so the doublespeak here is really difficult.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition? No one on the Democratic side. Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been on this committee for 23 years. I've participated at some level in every energy and environmental debate we've had in that 23-year period. And I want the members and those that are watching the debate to understand something. We're moving from a market-based approach to energy to a, I don't want to say a political-based approach. That's probably too strong. But the majority on the committee is in the process of making determinations that says it's more important that we have a politically correct energy and environmental policy than that we really have a energy policy and environmental policy that maximizes domestic energy and minimizes environmental emissions. When my good friend, the subcommittee chairman, says that you've got a lot of new nuclear that's going to come online, that's true. At least I hope it's true. But somehow, because it's going to happen, we shouldn't count it in the renewable electricity standard that's before the committee. That's a political decision. That's not a market-based decision. Nuclear is zero emissions. If the goal of this bill is to reduce CO2 and the other greenhouse gases that the bill would regulate, then nuclear has to be a part of that equation. It is zero emissions. If we really want to go to a less carbon-intensive economy and not totally wreck the economy in the process, there are two fuel choices out there that are going to have to be a part of the equation. One is baseload nuclear power for electricity generation, and the other is natural gas. There is a field in Pennsylvania and New York that probably has between 250 and 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Now, natural gas is a fossil fuel, and natural gas will create CO2, but it creates approximately a half to two-thirds as much per megawatt as coal. So I wouldn't argue that nuclear is renewable in the sense that hydro is, and biomass, and wind and solar. But I would argue in the sense that it is zero emissions and clean, it is just as viable. So if we really want to move to a less carbon-intensive economy, we should accept definitions that include new nuclear and new hydro, as Mr. Walden has talked about, because they're zero emissions, they're domestic, and they're clean. And so at some point in today's process or tomorrow's process, somebody on our side is going to offer an amendment to the definition of the renewable portfolio standard, renewable electricity standard that's in this bill to include hydro and nuclear. We're not opposed to wind, we're not opposed to solar, we're not opposed to biomass, we're not opposed to any of those, but we should still keep some shred of a market-based decision process. And then if you want to go beyond that, you can create some incentives to get more wind and more solar and more thermal power into the grid. But we have the best energy situation in the world because we have, for the last 150 years, used a market-based approach. This bill is going away from that. But don't go so far away from it that the one totally zero-free emission that's base loadable right now, the technology is available right now, take that off the table. You're playing political games when you do things like don't put it in the denominator. That's a political decision. It's not based on fact, and all these companies that our good chairman just pointed out that are for this compromise, if you ask them if they're for the Stearns language, especially if they could take a secret ballot, they would say yes. They may have accepted this as the best they think they can get, but they don't believe for a minute it's the best public policy. Stearns moves us to a better public policy. We should vote for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. Who seeks recognition? Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Markey.
I thank the gentlelady very much. Let me read to you. First. We'll begin with John Rowe. John Rowe is the CEO of Exelon. Exelon is the largest nuclear utility in the United States. 20% of all of the United States nuclear industry's power capacity is controlled by that one company, Exelon. Here's what Mr. Rowe, in a speech to the National Press Club 1 week ago, said about this bill. He discussed the bill, and he said it will drive the low-carbon investments and discourage high-carbon investments. Mr. Rowe also stated that the renewable electricity standard contained in the bill should be achievable without undue stress on either the economy or the reliability of our power supplies. Mr. Rowe continued to hope for a bipartisan result on the House floor and the Senate, and that my Republican friends in the Senate will follow the lead of their candidate in the last presidential election. This is a real opportunity. So that's the largest electric utility, nuclear electric utility in the United States. I already read to you what Constellation Energy said about this bill. Mr. Rowe makes specific reference to the renewable electricity standard. Again, we're not trying here to discriminate against nuclear. Each of the largest nuclear utilities in the United States, for the most part, are supportive of the bill because it does create a climate where nuclear power can revive. But on top of that, there's a production tax credit for nuclear. The nuclear industry receives 1.8 cents per kilowatt hour of power generated for the first 8 years of nuclear power plant operation. Plants that come online before 2021 are eligible for all or a portion of that tax credit. This is on the par with the production tax credit for renewable power, but the production tax credits for renewables expires in 2012. So they have a better guarantee, a longer-term guarantee in the law today. In the 2005 Energy Act that was passed out of this committee by you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman Barton at the time, and President Bush provided upwards of $18.5 billion of loan guarantees for the nuclear power industry. So, and let's go back over the years. Over the years, the nuclear industry has received $145 billion worth of federal subsidies. Combined, the solar and wind industry has received $5 billion. So in talking about socialism, if you look at what the nuclear industry has received from this committee, what the coal industry in terms of subsidies has received from this committee, the oil industry received and benefits from this committee, it so dwarfs the benefits that we have or even remotely intend to provide for these nascent renewable energy sources. The truth is, this entire bill is a clean energy bill. We have in huge subsidies for clean coal. Huge. Much more than we have in for renewables. We already have all of these nuclear programs as well. No one is saying that any of these technologies are going to be excluded. All we're saying is that over in this area, and it's an exhaustive list, again, it's wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, biogas, hydropower, marine and hydrokinetic renewable energy, fuel cells, landfill gas, wastewater treatment gas, coal mine methane, qualified waste to energy, animal waste, algae, all of this, triple credits for distributed generation.
The gentleman yield.
Let me finish. Please let me finish. All of this offers a real potential for job creation and innovation in our country and the production of new technologies that we can export overseas. The nuclear industry, however, as they look at this bill, these largest of all nuclear utilities in the country are saying, we support the bill. And as John Rowe is saying from Exelon, specifically saying that the renewable electricity standard is something that he supports. So I know what you're trying to do, but please understand that it's a balanced bill. Nuclear, coal, oil, gas, all these renewables, all part of the mix, including new hydro, okay, all of it. And I just beg you to give these new renewable energy technologies a chance to play their role as well.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Who seeks recognition? Mr. Upton.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to say, I want to go back to my statement a few minutes ago. We shouldn't be picking winners or losers in this bill. This amendment is about, and this bill should be about the overall reduction of emissions, especially if they can be carbon-free. And so whether it's existing hydro or existing nuclear or new hydro or new nuclear, if it reduces carbon emissions, that's the goal that we all want, whether it's wind, solar, hydro, tide, you name it. And this amendment, if it doesn't prevail today, I'd like to think that we ought to have this same debate on the House floor, because I'm convinced that folks are going to look at this and say, shouldn't this be part of the mix? And I, for one, would be willing to raise the RPS number overall if we can include that as part of the base, because that means we're going to rely less on foreign energy. And that's what this bill ought to be all about. And if we can do it from renewables, that too ought to be where we go. And I yield to my friend, Mr. Stearns from Florida.
Thank you. You know, sometimes you debate, you can talk too much. But let me just make 3 points. When I look at this list, Mike Ross has 2 nuclear power plants in Arkansas. Ms. Eshoo, there's 4 in California, Ms. Harmon. There's 5, Ms. Representative Castor, in Florida. Mr. Barrow, we have 4 nuclear power plants in Georgia. Bobby Rush has 11 in Illinois. There's 2 in Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Dingell has 3. Mr. Pallone has 4 in New Jersey. Elliot Engel, you have 6 in New York. Mr. Butterfield, you have 5 in North Carolina. Mr. Doyle, you have 9 nuclear power plants in Pennsylvania. Tennessee, there's 3 for Mr. Gordon. And of course, in Texas, Mr. Green, you have 3 nuclear power plants. And Rick Boucher has 4 in Virginia. My question to all of you, why should states be punished because you have nuclear power plants? If you vote for my amendment, you're going to make it easier for your state to meet the RES standard. But if you vote against it, you're going to increase energy prices, make it harder. Now, particularly a state like California that has so much fiscal problems in trying to meet their budgets, I would think you'd want a little relief. So states should not be punished because they have nuclear power. So I reach across the aisle. You voted with Mr. Waxman on every amendment last night. It doesn't hurt to show independence to vote for the Stearns amendment, Mr. Doyle. Because, Mr. Doyle, you've got these nuclear power plants. You could rise up and show leadership here by saying, enough is enough. We're going to show bipartisanship, and this is the place we're going to do it. And I have time left for anybody who would like to.
Yeah, will the gentleman yield? Gentleman yield.
It's my time. I'll yield to the gentleman from Oregon.
Well, I understand fully what the gentleman is saying, and certainly with nuclear power, this is a big issue. With hydropower, it's an issue. And the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, keeps saying you're all for new hydropower as one of and the biomass, and we'll continue that debate as well. But the language in your bill precludes new hydropower. Let me say that again. Page 15, line 4, the language precludes new hydropower. So don't tell us that you're all for new hydropower development when your own bill is written in a way that any engineer will tell you precludes that new hydropower from counting. Because you can't add hydropower to a facility and not manipulate the water behind the facility. We come from hydropower in the West. They manage the flow behind the dams all the time. And in fact, when it comes to wind energy, they praise hydro as a natural match because you store the water when the wind's blowing, and when the wind stops blowing, you release the water to generate the hydropower to balance out the load. So I don't know if you have much hydro in Massachusetts. I don't know if you have much hydro in some of these other states, but we got it in Oregon. We have it in Washington, we have it in Idaho, and they use it to balance out the load. And this language, according to the Bonneville Power Administration, does not work for them. I'm not making this stuff up. I asked the head of the Corps of Engineers, who isn't weighing in on the legislation, but in my region, could you even do an in-stream hydro project and have it count? And he said, I don't think so, because you're going to naturally have some backup behind that, because that's how you produce the energy that runs through it. So the language doesn't work. So at least let's get the language right.
The gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
Chair sees none. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know John Rowe. John Rowe is a friend of mine, and Mr. Chairman, you're no John Rowe. John Rowe supports Yucca Mountain. John Rowe understands that you can safely transport interstate nuclear waste. John Rowe would never claim, as you have numerous times, Mr. Chairman, about a mobile Chernobyl. John Rowe would never do that. What is John Rowe doing? John Rowe is doing exactly what everyone that you brought in behind closed doors is doing. The responsibility of corporate America, especially the CEO, is protect shareholder wealth. So they're cutting a deal to make sure that they protect the shareholder wealth, which goes back to the debate. We're fighting for the ratepayer. This debate is, who's fighting for the ratepayer? The corporate titans are my friends, all right? I'm a Caterpillar supporter. I'm an Exelon supporter. I'm an Ameren supporter. A lot of these companies that have negotiated deals, they support me. But I know that they're in the room to protect shareholder wealth, the wealth of the bondholders, the wealth of the stockholders. And that's okay, because they are afraid that if they're not in the room, they're going to be destroyed. And so who's talking for the ratepayer? That's what this debate is about. Question to council. What is the emissions difference between, the carbon emissions difference between new nuclear and old nuclear?
I don't have that information at the table.
Would the chairman like to respond about the difference between the carbon emissions between new nuclear and old nuclear?
Does the gentleman know the answer?
I do know the answer.
Oh, good. So I'd like to
never ask a question that you don't know the answer to, Mr. Chairman. You taught me that.
I want to dial a friend, and I'm going to call John Shimkus. I'm going to ask John Shimkus for the answer. Well, all right, we have John Shimkus on the line.
How about 50-50?
The question is, what is the difference between old?
There is no difference in carbon emissions.
No difference. Oh.
But let me ask another question. Since part of this bill talks about indirect land use and renewable fuel calculation, let me ask you now a more difficult question, Mr. Chairman. What is the indirect carbon use of new nuclear plants? If you're going to build a new nuclear facility, if you were going to calculate carbon emissions, would building a new nuclear power plant create more carbon emissions or less carbon emissions?
You know, this is a lot like being up in my district at MIT, because up there, a lot of the questions actually come in the form of answers. And it really simplifies things for you when you're having a discussion. So I'm assuming that I'm in that kind of a discussion again. So the answer is?
There will be a bigger carbon footprint when you build a new nuclear power plant than an existing power plant. Okay, just now, building a new nuclear power plant has 10 times more job creation ability than anything in this renewable portfolio development. Cost per kilowatt hour of nuclear power baseload generation is approximately a half to less of kilowatt power. That's the concern about renewables, just keeping it at wind and solar because it costs more. So if you're worried about the ratepayer, you need strong baseload generation. I want to end on this. Take a steel mill that uses 545 megawatts a year. It would require roughly 138 turbines on roughly 12,443 acres of land for a total output. However, during peak load at that steel mill, it requires 100,000 kilowatts. For that, you would need roughly 825 turbines and on 33,000 acres of land to account for peak load. And remember, renewable power never can be relied upon for baseload generation because the wind is not always going to blow and the sun is not always going to shine. So if you're concerned about the ratepayer, you would support this amendment, and I yield back my time.
I think we've had a good debate on this amendment, and I hope the members are ready to proceed to a vote.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Yes, and I certainly won't take 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my good friend, Mr. Stearns, for asking us all to exhibit some independence. I'm trying to remember in the 7 years I've been on this committee how many times he exhibited independence when the shoe was on the other foot, and I think I can count it on one finger.
Mr. Doyle,
having said that,
just
Mr.
one
Chairman,
quick thing. I voted yesterday with
Which
you.
finger?
I voted. I voted with you yesterday. I was the only Republican. Did you know that?
I'm sorry, Cliff. I take it back. On 2 fingers, I can count how many times. Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my friend for reminding me that we have 9 nuclear power plants in Pennsylvania. My state has a renewable energy standard. Pennsylvania's is 18%. We have a 2-tiered system of how you can meet that standard. Nowhere in Tier 1 or Tier 2 do we allow nuclear to be counted as part of the mix. We allow photovoltaic, solar thermal, wind, low-impact hydro, geothermal, biomass, biologically derived methane gas, coal mine methane, and fuel cells. And our Tier 2 is waste coal, distributed generation systems, demand-side management, large-scale hydro, municipal solid waste, wood pulping and manufacturing byproducts, and integrated gasification combined cycle. So Pennsylvania is well aware of how we meet an RES standard in our state. It's 18%. We don't include nuclear. I think this amendment that we've reached in the bill is a pretty good accommodation, and I intend to oppose the amendment. Thank you,
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
It's my understanding that the base that Pennsylvania uses for the 18% includes coal.
Includes?
Coal? Right? Waste coal?
Yeah, waste coal.
Would you accept that as part of this amendment?
Well, now that's not your amendment. Your amendment was nuclear, and I'm
well, what about if we add it?
Well, you know what? That's a separate amendment you can offer, and we'll talk to you then. But Mr. Stearns' amendment talks about nuclear, and he was kind enough to remind us that I have 9 nuclear plants in my state, and that somehow that I should be affected by that. And I'm saying my state has a standard. Nuclear is not part of it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Would gentleman yield to me for just comment, not a question?
Sure.
I just want to say that we're having a pretty good debate, and we've already had 2 great lines. We've had the Ed Markey, I'm going to dial John Shimkus, which beat anything he said yesterday, and the Lee Terry line, which finger, is probably going to make YouTube. So we're starting off pretty good today, Mr. Chairman.
The chair would only note that we've sunk to a new low if we're debating for YouTube.
It is what it is.
It is what it is. We'll now proceed to a vote.
Chairman?
Who seeks recognition? Mr. Boyer, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
You feel you must speak on this amendment?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I encourage all members to do is exactly what I've been doing. Go to EEI, find out what the breakout of your energy portfolio is per congressional district. When you do that and you do the math, you'll figure out where you fall out. What I find most interesting, it also, well, let me just show you what I've learned. And I'll start with, I went to Speaker Pelosi. In order to make, and I looked at Mr. Welsh, I looked at Mr. Inslee, and I looked at my own in Indiana. So here's what I've learned. When I do the calculations, I look at Ms. Pelosi. She has 23% nuclear, 13% hydro, 47% natural gas, and 4% coal, 1% fossil fuel. So when I do that, I say, okay, with regard to base generation, 75% there is going to be, actually more than that. She's got 23% old nuclear, natural gas, coal, and old fossil. You add all that to figure out what your base is. Or excuse me, then when you get your base, it's 7, it's 5, there you go, 75%. Now you go, what her base then is 25%. Then of that base of 25%, what is 20% of the 25%? Guess what? She fits. It absolutely works because she is 12% renewables. Gee, what a shock. We've actually come up with an equation that the Speaker Pelosi has no penalties whatsoever. Amazing. Now, I'll look at my state of Indiana. In Indiana, let's see, I'm 96% coal, I'm 3% natural gas, I'm 99.6% is my baseline. So in order to create my base, I'm at 0.4%. I got to get, wow, I got a long way to go. I get a huge penalty. You can do this per congressional district. If you look at Mr. Inslee, for example, I looked at this one. Mr. Inslee of Washington, he's 91% hydro, 5% nuclear, he's 3% wind, and less than 1% coal and natural gas. I think that's extraordinary. I think that's absolutely wonderful. But then when I look at that and say, okay, of his base, what does he have left? He has to do then 20% of a base of 9%. 20% less of the base of 9%, it works. He fits. There's no penalty. You can go down the line per congressional district, and I'll do it. I'll figure out where the votes are. This is pretty doggone easy. And I guess that's how we do it. Cutting deals, getting votes, figuring out the equation, satisfying people. That's what's been done here. Who pays and who doesn't? That's right. It comes down to who's going to pay and who doesn't. And so now it's Mr. Shimkus' point exactly. Who's going to look out for the little guy? So I'm really bothered by this. If we really want to do it by sound public policy, stop the games. Because that's what we have here. These are games.
Gentleman yield.
Someone is at stake.
Gentleman yield.
I'd be more than happy to yield.
Are you suggesting that ICE did something untoward here about
No, I'm just saying you're the benefit of a great equation.
I just want to make this really clear that you are not
I reclaim my time. You are the benefit of a great equation. I'm upset because the state of Indiana, I am penalized in the state of Indiana. The Midwest is penalized. You are going to receive a great benefit in the Pacific Northwest. What we should do, if we really care about, quote, the emissions of CO2, then let's create permits based on the emissions. Don't do taxpayer giveaway to utilities out there that Indiana, we have to go out then in the market and then buy these. First of all, whose money is it anyway? Trillions of dollars of taxpayers' money? We're going to take it from taxpayers, and you're making it sound as though we're giving it to someone? No, we're taking it. We got to borrow it from China. I encourage all members to get into the bill, look at your energy portfolio, and do the math so you'll know where you fall out. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Inslee, do you wish to be recognized?
I do, and I'm sorry to...
Would you be willing to be recognized for 3 minutes?
Yes, certainly. I'm sorry to have to talk at this late moment, but given the last comments, I think it's necessary. And I think we were having a good, healthy debate until the last little round there. The fact of the matter is we have a very diverse country. Where I live, we're blessed with abundant hydropower. We've done well on clean energy, not because of great leadership from a House member, but because we have some great rivers out in the Northwest. And we have struggled mightily to try to develop an energy policy that responds to all of our districts. And that is why in this bill we have made very substantial progress in ameliorating the differences of our areas. We have ameliorated it by reducing the target. We have ameliorated it by adding a clean energy bank that will help finance new nuclear power. We have ameliorated it by including $1 billion for coal research that goes only to coal research for those areas, like the previous speakers, that are heavily coal dependent. We have found every way under this green earth.
Will the gentleman from Washington...
Let me finish for a moment, to ameliorate the fact that we have different districts. But I want to answer a fundamental question that Mr. Stearns' amendment proposes, which is a very important one. Why, if nuclear power and hydropower are zero CO2 emitting, are they treated differently than wind or concentrated solar energy? That is a very important question for us to answer. And the answer is this. Whereas nuclear and hydro are very clean and very efficient and very efficacious, they are not new. The effort on the renewable electrical standard is as much to make new types of technology as it is to make renewable energy. Hydropower is perfectly renewable and perfectly clean, but it is old unless you do run-of-the-river. And by the way, I want to tell you there's some new technology, run-of-the-river, where you don't have to dam it and you get energy that is included in this. The thrust of the renewable electrical standard...
Will the gentleman yield?
Just a minute, let me finish. The thrust of the renewable electrical standard is to create new technologies. If we voted for this amendment, you will get less concentrated solar technology in America. You will get less advanced wind in America. You will get less engineered geothermal in America. You will get less cellulosic biofuels in America. You will get less algae-based biofuels in America. You will get less advanced efficiency in America. You will get less hydrokinetic energy from wave power, a new source of energy, and tidal power, which are included in this bill. So let us not forget, there is a difference between old and new. We will never skin this cat unless we create new energy technologies. We can do that without this amendment. Thank you.
All right. Can I be recognized?
Who seeks recognition? If the gentleman, would the gentleman be willing to take 2 minutes?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it.
Let's do 2 minutes, and then we're going to proceed to a vote, and I hope we don't have to vote, but I think an hour and a half on one amendment's enough time. Gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate that, and I do think that this nuclear component is important enough to have this level and time for discussion. But adding up what the gentleman from Washington has said and Massachusetts, this bill is about climate change, global warming, and reducing CO2. And it doesn't, what we should be doing is allowing each region to use what type of clean energies, and I'm going to tell you, I only have wind and the ability to do nuclear. So I want to support nuclear power. This argument of limiting nuclear power because somehow it's going to step on wind and solar doesn't make sense to me. As long as we can get to zero emissions and generate electricity, let's do it. And I'll yield to my friend from Indiana.
Mr. Inslee, when I look at the math with regard to your particular district and just listen to your arguments, if you included hydro into the base, then you get penalized. Because as of right now, in your base, you're completely covered because you're at 3% wind. Your base is at 9% of the total pie. But if you include hydro, you're going to get penalized. So actually, from your perspective, no, you won't get penalized. You should encourage yourself to be hydro to be included in the base so you can get the new clean technologies that you've just argued for. Why don't you offer an amendment then to include hydro in the base, to include new nuclear in the base? So that fits your argument to want to have clean jobs in your district. But you're not doing that. You're not doing that because the math tells you you're completely covered in your 3% wind. When you get 20% of the 9%, you're clean. You're good to go.
Gentlemen, yield just for a moment.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Actually, I supported a higher standard for the country and the state of Washington. In order to reach a compromise, we lowered it. But in the state of Washington, just so you'll know, my constituents voted by an initiative to adopt a stronger standard than we're even going to have here. I am comfortable my constituents answered your question, which is they want new technology, and they passed a state referendum to say that. We've already done this.
Well, you're covered by this bill.
The all time is expired. We only have one amendment to vote on, although a lot of different ideas have been discussed. And that amendment is the Stearns Amendment. All those in favor of the Stearns Amendment will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
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 Mr. Chairman, I ask for a roll call.
Mr. Barton asked for a roll call. We'll proceed to a roll call vote.
Mr. Waxman.
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, no. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Wiener. Mr. Wiener, no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Mr. Hill. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen, no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Barton.
Aye.
Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Upton.
Aye.
Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booyer. Mr. Booyer votes aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mrs. Myrick. Mrs. Myrick, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes aye. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes aye.
Have all members responded to the roll?
Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes aye.
Yes.
Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Mr. Murphy?
Which Mr. Murphy?
Mr. Murphy from Connecticut is walking in the door, and Mr. Radonovich also seeks recognition.
Donovich is here.
Yeah, you'll be called in a minute. Mr. Radonovich?
Not recorded, Mr. Chairman.
Now he's recorded voting aye.
Votes aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut votes no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll?
28 to 26.
Any member wish to change his or her vote?
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
Mr. Barton?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to change my vote from aye to no.
Mr. Barton wishes to change his vote from aye to no. Mr. Pallone, how do you wish to vote? You wish to vote with Mr. Barton? No.
Who's that? I'm sorry. Mr. Pallone was no?
Mr. Pallone's no.
Mr. Pallone votes no. And Mr. Barton?
Change from aye to no.
Mr. Barton is off aye and on no.
Any other member wish to be recorded or change a vote? If not, the clerk will tally the vote.
30 to 26. That just gives us the right to, I can read it. By 4. 30 to 26.
Yes. Clerk will
On that vote,
vote.
Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 26 and the ayes were 30.
26 ayes, 30 noes. The amendment is not agreed to.